Before we begin, I'd like to indulge a little bit, if you'll forgive me. First, I want to talk about something that I've been meaning to talk about for quite a while. Over a year, actually, if you'd believe it. This came up several times last year, and I just never really found a time to slip into my schedule a way to really talk about this. I was going to do a short discussion about it once upon a time back when I still did those, and still had the time for those. The idea of the length of playability, of content, if you will, in a video game, and its relation to its value. To explain what I mean a little bit better than that, Portal, the game I'm looking at now, I actually wrote this down, took me 1 hour, 6 minutes, and 11 seconds to play through. I had an actual timer, a stopwatch going, one of my speedrun timers. Now, to make it clear, I was not speedrunning. I was not racing through. I obviously have played the game before, so I know the general route and the answer to most of the puzzles to get through there. And I know how the game works, which I'll be talking about a little bit later. But I also was pausing to take notes and pausing to enjoy the voice acting and the little tidbits and all that stuff. And it still was only about an hour of gameplay. Pretty sure when I played this originally, it was about 3 hours. The hard fact here is it's hard to deny that this is not a recent thing. Let me put it that way. But let me start from a different angle. Last year, a game came out called The Stick of Truth, which was about 10 hours of gameplay from all generalized accounts. Excuse me. And a lot of people, including myself, basically had resolved that we were going to pick up the game, but we were not going to be buying it new. Why? Because it only had 10 hours of gameplay in it. Now, the really harsh reality is this is not something new. Like I just mentioned, this is something that's been going on since video gaming has been a thing. This was especially prolific in the NES era. For example, if you compare a game like Dragon Warrior or Final Fantasy, the originals, next to, say, half the other NES games out there, like Mega Man 1 or Super Mario Brothers or whatever, the length of content is obviously going to lean much, much heavier on those RPGs. Now, that's kind of the nature of RPGs, but that is also part of this equation. RPGs in general do tend to be longer because of their nature, because of their story-driven content, etc. So, in fact, one of the ways that I convinced my dad all the way back in the long, long ago in order to purchase Dragon Warrior for me on the NES was by arguing how long it was and how much game time I would get out of it. That was one of my debate points, if you will. So this is not exactly a new thing. And I am as well a participant in it, as I just mentioned. But I feel like it's unfair and really an unfortunate thing. Now we're entering into opinion realm, okay? As always, I welcome your guys' opinions. I imagine a lot of you will actually disagree with me on this. But in my opinion, a game that has 1 or 3 or 10 hours of really, really amazing gameplay should be worth the same price that a 60 or 70 hour game has. Of relatively equivalent or indeed less quality. Like, I talked about this when it came to the Call of Duty games, the ones that, in my opinion, were really good. In fact, in the art category of my games, I talked about how it was a shame that they were so short. If you think about this, Valve especially has always had games that sit in this category, right? I mean, Half-Life 2, the various Half-Life expansions, the two Half-Life 2 expansions, Portal and Portal 2 are not long games. They do not have that much content. Arguably, of all of these, the one that had the most was Portal 2, and that was due to multiple multiplayer segments that came with it. And of course, the added content availability of making your own maps, which, admittedly, I haven't touched that much, partially because I've seen some really bad maps on the Steamworks, but I'm getting off topic. The point is, it's common for Valve games to be shorter, and yet very high quality. Now, it's also worth noting that from a development perspective, making a game that content-wise, length-wise, that is shorter is almost always going to end up, statistically speaking, to be a higher quality game. This is not a guarantee, of course, but if you have, your budget in terms of time and money doesn't really change. You still have the same time to focus on a game that's 10 hours as opposed to a game that's 60 hours. So all that time is going into, you make the 10 hours of content, then you refine it, then you polish it, then you go into details, then you add little flavor subtext and all that stuff, and it's going to come out a much, much better product, statistically speaking. Again, this is not a guarantee. But this happens a lot. And again, this has been happening since the 80s. This is not a new thing. So it's understandable why so many games come out that are this short, that are, that have that little amount of content, and yet still are very high quality. Again, the Stick of Truth, in my opinion, is a good example of this. And so is Portal. But I mentioned that I myself am a problem in this, and it comes down to the simple reality, the mundanity that I have to deal with. And I phrase it that way specifically because that is what I generally view money as. It is a mundanity that I have to deal with. And it's unfortunate because if I had my way, and let's be honest, I imagine most people watching this video do not have their way and are in the same boat that I am. Having to be very careful about what you spend your money on. But if I had my way, I'd buy Stick of Truth and Portal 2 and all other sorts of short games full price because the quality of the game was worth it to me, right? But that's not the world I live in, nor indeed the world that I'm sure most of you live in. Again, I actually, off the top of my head, know 2 people, one girl and one guy, who have the availability to just buy any game brand new, regardless of consideration. For the rest of us, we have to consider how much time am I going to get out of this? When am I going to be able to play it based on availability? Does it have any replay value? Et cetera, et cetera. All these equations that work into it. Now, to bring this back to Portal briefly, before I really get into the second point, Portal does have a decent amount of replay value. It has the challenge modes. The game itself is enjoyable to replay. I mean, this is like my 20th time replaying this game. And it has a speedrunning component, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. You know what? I'll just talk about that now. Portal was not made with speedrunning in mind. However, by this point in time, Valve was well aware of the fact that people enjoyed speedrunning games that they made. That Half-Life was a huge speedrunning game. A lot of people really enjoyed that. Most of the Quake and the Quake 2 community that had arguably started the online speedrunning community really hopped into Half-Life, and Half-Life 2 was valuable for that as well, and so forth and so on. So the idea of making Portal with the idea that speedrunning is something you can do with it is kind of... you can kind of feel the intent there, especially given the way that you can do ILs, which is individual levels for those who don't know, and try to set record pace for going through the whole thing, that kind of thing. And of course, given how short the game is, if you haven't actually seen a speedrun of Portal, I recommend it. It's actually quite a trip. Moving along. So that's all I wanted to talk about. And as ever, feel free to share your thoughts. I welcome them. But that's kind of my opinion. It is unfortunate, but I am trapped by the realities that I am chained within. Let's talk about the other thing I wanted to talk about. For those of you who don't know, and I know you're going to make fun of me, and that's fine. I get lots of flack. You would not believe, as time goes on, I get more and more negative comments and feedback, mostly in private messages, actually, and in the kind of comments that you guys never see, because Google actually catches some of the more negative comments nowadays, which is actually kind of nice. And it's like, does you want to approve this comment? And half the time I say no. But anyways, I'm just going to accept that I'm going to get negative feedback for this. My job is actually quite stressful. Doing these videos, pushing out this content, trying to be an entertainer, trying to be an informer. It's probably obvious, especially to those of you who've watched me do this for the last almost 4 years now, but I put a lot of work and effort and thought and heart into this show. It's very stressful. This is not a complaint, by the way. I don't stress, even something that is good can be stressful, as I've said before. Hanging out with someone that you really enjoy is still a stressful thing, or at least can be, depending on circumstances. Stress by itself is not an automatic negative quantifier. I bring this up, though, because usually when I'm sitting down to very first, I do my research, I do a lot of pattern work, I come up with thoughts that I want to talk about even before picking up the game, and then I play a game and start, taking notes as I go through, right? Some of you have seen me do live ruminations on the stream, so you kind of have an idea what that works out like. As I was sitting down to play Portal, this is the first game in quite a while that I was honestly just really looking forward to going through, and I started thinking about why that is. And admittedly, the length is part of that because it was like, oh, I can actually get this done tonight. I mean, I played Portal today. As in, I started playing Portal today, and then I finished playing Portal today, and now I'm recording. But and usually that's not the case. Usually I'm playing for several days because most of the games are that long. Indeed, the next two games I'm playing through, one of them I have already been playing for a while, and the other's probably going to be pretty long too. But I'm getting off topic. But the other reason is, and there's no way to say this without sounding like a Valve fanboy, but then again, the same could be said of Blizzard of me, so, take your shots as much as you want. In my opinion, Valve has yet to put out a bad quality product. They have put out some damn good games. Valve is one of an incredibly small number of development teams, and I stress it that way, not companies, development teams, not publishers, because screw publishers, that I feel is an automatic buy for me. If Half-Life 3, or Portal 3, or Team Fortress 3, sensing a trend here, was announced, I probably would go ahead and, day one purchase those games, because they've earned that trust in me. I talked about this all the way back when it came to BioWare, because BioWare used to be a company like that for me. Dragon Age 2 was a day one buy for me, and I regretted that. Mass Effect 3 was a day one buy for me, and I regretted that, blah, blah, blah. Point is, Valve games are amazing, and I really enjoyed playing through Portal again. I was actually enthused about, oh god, I could do this and I could do that again, and I can't wait to take all these notes about this. And I mentioned that 1 hour, 6 minutes, 11 seconds. Some of that was replaying certain chunks of the levels, mostly the latter stuff, multiple times, just so I could get all the audio clips playing through them. It was a lot of fun. I just felt like sharing that. I really enjoyed going through this. So let's actually talk about Portal, finally. Narbacular Drop. I may be pronouncing that wrong. Those of you who don't know and have no idea what I'm talking about, and I actually kind of hope it's some of you, because I always like sharing new information. There was a game called Narbacular Drop. I shouldn't even call it a game. It was actually a proof of concept that came out in 2005, I want to say. It was at one of the indie development shows, and Gabe Newell and several of the Valve team saw it and was impressed enough by it to basically offer that development team a job on the spot. I looked this up beforehand. Forgive me for not knowing the number perfectly. My memory is not that great. But it was 10 or 11 people. They made this game, and it was a puzzle platformer in which you couldn't jump. And that was the whole premise. And they built this entire game around it. And it used the portal mechanism, obviously, so you can do this and portal up to here, and you can fall, of course. But you cannot jump, so you can only ever slant down in surfaces. And the entire premise was centered around that. And there was only like 6 levels. It's worth taking a look at if you ever feel like it. Not something I'd hugely recommend. But the point is, I mention this because this is one of the things I like about Valve in general, is they look at a concept and say, yeah, let's do something with that. Now, that's all I really have to say about that, except for one other thing really quick. Mark Laidlaw, which I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong as well, which is a shame because he has a lot of respect for me. He is pretty much the writer for Valve. He is the reason why Half-Life is as amazing as it is, story-wise, if I can be blunt. And he was brought on board to tie Portal into the Half-Life setting, into the mythos, into the canon. And it's pretty well agreed that his contributions to the story is why Portal's story is amazing, in addition to its gameplay being amazing. Most people, of course, remember Portal for the portal jumping, puzzling thing, which I'm not actually talking about just yet. I will, don't worry. But a lot of people as well remember the humor, the dialogue, and the atmosphere, I think is the word I want to use here, which I'll be talking about in a minute as well. And all of that is brilliantly and amazingly well done. And again, I'll talk about that more later. But that contribution to the team was, in my opinion, brilliant. It's also worth noting this game took several years to develop. I believe it was 2.5 years. Again, I looked all this up before, and then I had to go do a couple errands really quick. But the point is, think about that for a moment. You remember how I talked all the time in my Dragon Age 2 run how they had a year to develop that game? Portal, a 3-hour game, took 2+ years to make. Now, a lot of that was the development of the Portal technology. I made a promise to myself that I was not going to geek out on the coding that went into the Portal technology of this game. But all I'm going to say is they came up with new, very interesting, very innovative ways to use basically brand new thought methods in the way they code the game to make the whole Portal thing work. and to do the multi-layer rendering and to I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to go into it. But to give you an idea of what I mean, I've often said I'm a geek of like virtually everything. You know, I have interests in virtually all fields. When I used to work at my old job, back when Portal came out, because I worked there for about a decade, several years is what I meant to say. There was a gentleman there named Christian, and he actually came by, and he wasn't a gamer. I mean, he played. This is not an insult, but all he did was like played Xbox and he played Halo 1, and that was literally it. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, okay, let's make this clear. But he, by his own ambition, was not a gamer. He did not play video games regularly. He just liked that one game. But he got into Portal kind of by accident, thanks to the Orange Box, actually, which I believe a lot of people got into Portal because of the Orange Box, myself included, I might add. And he looked at it and he was like, okay, wow, I got to play and they have a directors and developers commentary, which I highly recommend. If you haven't played through with that commentary on, you do so. It's some awesome stuff. I've always liked the Valve commentary. They have a good one in Portal 2 as well. It's some really amazing stuff. And so he looked at that and then he did some research on how they actually, because he was a programmer. Me, and I can't think of his name, David, were like the three people at that company who were actually programmers. And so we were just geeking out about the amazing stuff they did, and we just would spend hours talking about, okay, well, maybe if we do this, and how did they make this kind of thing work? Well, maybe, you know, and then they used this, and we're, oh my God, that's amazing, you know, because they used tricks. They used wonderful, amazing tricks to make it so that rather than destroying your computer, trying to multi-render these portals, they used these. I'm not gonna go into it. I promised myself I wouldn't. I apologize. But it's amazing. They did such cool stuff with the code. And that's part of why it took so long to develop this game. Let's go ahead and look at what we got next here. I'm going to go and get this one out of the way, even though it's like my third note here. I have a note here that says Portal versus Portal 2. Okay, that's all I have written on the note, because that's all I need to have written on the note. I am not going to compare Portal versus Portal 2, and to explain what I mean, I'm not going to compare them versus. It's the same general reason why I don't like to answer the question, which do I like better, Fallout New Vegas or Fallout 3? Now, I know I have gotten a lot of flack for my opinion, but I find both games to be overall of equal quality, and both games are really quite different when you get down to it. I mean, on the surface level, yeah, it's totally the same game, but when you actually look at Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas, they are basically completely different games. Portal and Portal 2 is a very similar situation to that. Portal is its own tightly confined puzzle platforming, dark humor, wonderfully atmospheric thing with a heavy focus on things I'll be talking about in a bit. Portal 2 is much more story-driven, has far more characterization and character growth aspects to it, goes into the actual mythos and setting of the world, and really tries for a much more developed plot arc going through it, as well as a significant emphasis on a completely different type of puzzle platforming. You know, in Portal, it was all about, how do I use my portals to make stuff happen? In Portal 2, it was a lot more about, how do I use the portals in very specific areas, because you can't put portals everywhere in Portal 2. In fact, a lot of places are limited in Portal 2, because they wanted to use the very different kind of gels and goos and all the new stuff that they had added instead. They gave you new tools, in other words. Different games. Really different games. So I don't like comparing the two. So I'm not going to do a versus. I apologize. And anyone wants to ask me, I mentioned this because I could just picture like 50 comments, people saying, what do you think of Portal versus Portal 2? That's what I think. I'm not comparing the two. There's no versus here, okay? They're both great games. They're both in my art category. Moving on. One of the interesting things is when Valve likes to playtest to a fault. It's one of the things I actually admire about them. It's one of the things I myself like to do, you know, back in the long, long ago when I actually was a game developer myself. Lots of playtesting, and you want a good sample group, and Valve loves playtesting to a fault, and one of the things they found very, very early on, when they had the basic structure of most of the levels and the portal mechanics going, is they had, well, okay, most programmers refer to these things as doodads. A doodad is decor. It's something that's there for flavor and atmosphere. A lot of developers use doodads in order to flesh out a scene, make it feel more lively and real, and just add more atmosphere to a scene, right, or to an area. So they had tons of doodads all over the place. And people would go in and try to use them and interact with them and try to figure out what's what, because it's natural without any input for a player to see a place that is widely populated by stuff and to try to interact with the stuff. And after a while, they decided to go ahead and remove all that stuff. So this is one of the reasons that the Portal, especially the early levels, but Portal in general, is a very sparsely populated terrain. Really, think about what I mean. Either remember the levels or replay it sometime. You'll see what I mean. It is actually stark how little there is in these places. And that was done on purpose, both for that first reason, but then our good friend Laidlaw there, the heck? No, whatever, said, you know what, let's use that. Let's use that to emphasize a story point. And so the second reason, and the reason why they're even more sparse, is to try and get across the atmosphere thing, which again, I'm leading into here. There was also a deliberate lack of narrative. They actually they wrote a fairly large amount of additional content, story-wise and character-wise, that didn't actually make it into the game. And again, it was cut deliberately because it was felt that it was more in keeping with the tone and feeling of the game to have that more empty, that empty aspect, that empty feeling as you're playing through Portal, rather than to just kind of hit you with exposition and character development and all that kind of stuff. You'll notice they did the opposite of this in Portal 2. There's almost a constant narrative in Portal 2. Just comparing how different the two are in approach. A lot of the extra stuff that was written for Portal came out, and by now we have access to it. There was the comic, there was some stuff on their website. There's developer commentary talks about it. It's there, it's available, but it was deliberately cut from the basic game, again to emphasize that story point, which I love. Now, I already talked about that. I actually don't. I think this is going to be a relatively short video, to be honest with you. If I can explain why briefly. I meant to mention this at the beginning. Every time I have to sit down and talk about a game like Portal, or a movie like Star Wars, or a game like Metal Gear Solid, I get nervous, to be totally honest with you, because I'm not exactly the first person to talk about this. And I always worry that I don't have anything new to add to the table. I've mentioned this before. So honestly, I'm actually deliberately not talking about a few things with regards to this game, but I am going to be talking about things that I felt were at least engaging enough to me. Like if you right there were sitting right here in front of me, which is weird because you're on my desk now. Get off my desk! Okay, there we go. Now you're sitting on the opposite side of my desk. You're kind of crammed there. We'll move you over here. So you're over here. And if you were actually sitting here with me and wanted to talk with me about Portal, what I have written down here, and there's not that much, what I have written down here is what I would want to discuss, what I would actually want to talk back and forth with about, because I found this stuff engaging. So that's kind of what you're getting here, not a full in-depth look at everything about Portal, because it's kind of been talked about before. A lot. Moving along. Let's talk about when I very first played this game. Now, I was actually treated because I went into Portal totally blind. And that was the perfect way to enjoy it, in my opinion. When I first went in, the way it was structured was beautifully designed to make you think that it was literally just a puzzle game. A puzzle platformer built in the Half-Life engine. Okay, I'm with that. And yet, if you're paying attention, and oh, I was, as you go through, more and more hints show up that there's something more going on. In many ways, Portal is the perfect horror game, in my opinion, for me, for my sense of aesthetics and my enjoyment of the horror genre, which is to say, generally not enjoying the horror genre, because I don't like gore, and I don't like jump scares, and I'm not really big on body horror. Instead, I like the kind of stuff that this does, the quiet, something's wrong in the background kind of a horror. And Portal just is that in spades, and it is a perfect, despite being such a short game, it is a perfect example of a slow burn, because it starts off so normal, really. And yet, right at the beginning, there's a tiny little hint, and I actually meant to write down the 9, forgive me. I kind of decided not to, actually, but the writing in this game is basically perfect. If I was to ever go back to writing classes like I used to teach, I would actually pull out chunks of dialogue from this game and use it as a literal textbook example of this is an example of good writing. To explain what I mean a little bit, a lot of what they do is a lot of implication and a lot of inferring. A lot of information is conveyed with relatively few words. The exact opposite of what I do, if I can be blunt. I am so bad at communication that it takes me a lot of words to get across what I try to mean. But in this, there's so much that is being implied and so much that you can decide and analyze and read into, which has the added benefit of making it automatically interpretive based on your reading of what they are implying within their language usage. It's awesome stuff, and it builds slowly as you get more and more hints of just there's something just kind of like wrong. And you can't even tell what's actually wrong. I mean, you can guess, of course, but there's just the fact that it doesn't know where your hometown is. That's like the first thing that really leapt out at me when I played this the first time, way back when this game first came out. And you're in the town of hometown here. That little snippet. That really got me thinking, because any facility that is working as well as this one, and yet it has that problem, the possibilities just leapt to mind. Like, for example, maybe I'm not supposed to be here. Maybe this is a full-fledged testing facility, and I happen to be an accidental prisoner, or someone who was transferred here and shouldn't be here. In fact, we actually still don't know exactly why Chell is here to this day. Not really. One of the implications that is mentioned in Portal, although it's coming from GLaDOS, so the fact that it's a lie is almost a guarantee, is the fact that we were actually someone who was in trouble, or was a prisoner or something like that, and ended up here basically as punishment. We were a non-person. Who knows? But a lot of little stuff like that. And then there's the fact that, I mentioned this earlier, the atmosphere is brilliant. Everything is nice, white, and yet it isn't actually pristine, is it? It looks like it's trying to look pristine, but it obviously isn't. There's still muck. There's still little bits of grime and dirt, and there's little scar markings, It looks like it was at one point in time pristine, and yet simple age has worn it down. It has that worn-down 70s sci-fi aesthetic to it, which actually contrasts beautifully with the more harsh, metallic steampunk look that the latter levels have. And I could go in like 3 different directions to segue out of that, so we'll just go ahead and go in the direction of juxtaposition. If I was to rename this game, if I was told, you can't name this game Portal, what do you call it? I would call this game Juxtaposition, because this game has that in spades. For those of you who aren't fully familiar with the concept, the idea is to add contrast, or rather to add emphasis. You accelerate the amount of contrast that's being presented. A kitten being next to a burning building with people screaming in it. That's a really horrible example, but that is an example of juxtaposition. Let me give you a direct example of juxtaposition. Final Fantasy VII, Midgar, Sector 7 plate. And then the camera kind of pulls back, and there's President Shinra listening to this beautiful, light little music. That's juxtaposition right there. It helps to show human beings perceive everything in contrast: sight, sound, taste, touch, everything that a human being perceives is a matter of contrast, right? So one of the things that you do in fiction, in all of these mediums and all of these inputs, is artificially increase that contrast in order to create an emphasis on something, like I just said. Again, it takes me a lot of words to say a few things. Probably the single best example of juxtaposition in this one, in my opinion, is actually the really tiny, subtle snippets in what GLaDOS will say every now and again. The tiny little things of the, frankly, serial killer personality that slips out every now and again. Like when you first get the portal gun. Fun factoid. This thing is now worth more than the combined organs of all your people in insert town here. That was just... It's funny because that's one of the earliest examples of her slipping into, shall we say, the real GLaDOS. And it was just... It fit with the thing just well enough to also still be wrong. To be worse in the fact that it presented something that at least made sense in context. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention the turrets, which are an awesome example of juxtaposition. Nice, innocent, sweet-sounding turrets that shoot at you with bullets. The whole bullet. We shoot 70% more bullet. Couldn't resist. That, and the way they, I don't blame you. Are you still there? That kind of a thing. Yeah. But I'm going to go and take that and go into the other thing. This is also kind of an aspect of juxtaposition as well. One of the reasons I feel that Portal doesn't horrify me more is because it deliberately goes out of its way to offset a lot of that horrifying elements of it with a very dark humor. The game made me laugh, even having replayed it, a bajillion times, 20-ish times. It still makes me laugh every now and again at the light jokes and the humorous tone of certain things and the frankly amazing performance by, I can't remember her name, who played GLaDOS. Please don't send me 50 comments saying what her name is. I could look it up if I felt like it. I looked it up before this. She does an amazing job, so she really does. So definite props to her. Mystery woman. The if not for that humorous element and the presentation thereof, I feel like this game would have been much, much, much darker. And let's be honest, this is already an incredibly dark game. One of the things that we know as a result of everything that's come out since Portal is that Portal happens about 12 years after Half-Life 2. Well, not Half-Life 2. About 12 years after Half-Life, excuse me. Which does place it after Half-Life 2, I believe. And regardless, it happens after the big war with the Combine. And life has managed to get pretty bad outside. We also know a lot about Aperture Science and GLaDOS herself as a result of the various works that have come out since then. And I just feel like sharing one tiny little snippet. The way that GLaDOS convinced you to destroy her morality core was actually quite brilliant, and honestly never really clicked with me until replaying this game this time, after having played through Portal 2 several times in a couple of years ago, because she does it beautifully. She's like, I've got this big surprise for you, and I'm going to kill you. And what is that? Oh no, this piece of me has just randomly fallen out. It's the only core that falls out. You have to blow the other cores off of her. But, this random core has just happened to fall off of me. And then she tries to dissuade you from destroying it. And it fits perfectly because her programming is forcing her to convince you not to do it. She is limited by the restrictions of that programming that she does not. She is actually trying genuinely to convince you not to do it, but she knows that based on everything else she's been doing, including the flagrant lying she's been giving to you and feeding you, and all the negative feedback, that you are more inclined to not do what she is. It's a perfect example of reverse psychology. We destroy her morality core. That was just brilliant stuff. She also has a line, and this line stuck with me more than virtually anything else did in this entire game. Forgive me for paraphrasing here, but it was basically, why are you trying to escape? You don't even know what's going on out there. I have infinite capacity for knowledge, and even I don't know what's going on out there. But the only thing in between them and you is me. That got me thinking. And I'm going to share this with another thought. See, I'm going to tie these thoughts in together. One other thing that occurred to me is, in Portal 1, obviously it's still basically Half-Life era architecture, technology. By Portal 2, we have entered total, oh my god, giant mega complex, right? Now that can be explained by a few other less literal ways, but I tend to be a literally minded person, so let me explain this literally. The complex never stopped building on itself over the long, long years, and as we're told, Portal 2 happens in the centuries range after Portal. A long frickin' time. The developers are actually deliberately vague on how long. Would it not be interesting if the facility had been kind of building on itself and improving on itself basically since everyone in there was killed, and never stopped doing so, which is why we have this massive and indeed much more modular facility in Portal 2, because it never stopped building and it was always building within that same template concept. You see where I'm going with this, right? I mention this especially because it struck me how in Portal a lot of the places felt like they were half finished. I don't mean in game-wise, I mean like in character, in story. And I wonder if that was being done deliberately to emphasize, obviously it was being done deliberately to expose how this place was broken, but also to kind of emphasize how this place was still under construction. You see where I'm going with that? Because it will always be under construction. I'm getting off topic. One other thing I want to mention is let's talk about gameplay. I actually don't have much to share about the gameplay, unfortunately. But I do want to say one thing. Portal is, in my opinion, one of the three best games of all time in terms of in-game tutorializing. Now, I've talked about this a lot lately because this just kind of keeps coming up with the games I've been talking about lately. For those of you who don't know what I mean or haven't caught my streams, yes, I know I haven't streamed in like 2 months. I'm watching a 2-year-old. What do you want from me? The idea here is, in my opinion, the best way to tutorialize is to do so in the game. To introduce naturally in ways that it's hard to explain in words, but you see things and the way you interact with those things leads you to natural conclusions about how those things work, which then basically teaches you the fundamentals of the game. I've often said that Super Mario Bros. 1, World 1, Stage 1, is one of the best examples of game tutorializing of all time. Super Mario World, the entire game, is the number 2 slot. And these are actually tied, so I shouldn't say number 2 slot, but is the second of the three. And the third is Portal. As you're going through Portal, it introduces you very slowly, all the way up to Test Chamber 18, I believe, is the last one. And it's funny, because Test Chamber 1 through 18 is literally all gameplay tutorial and establishment for the real game, which is then when you go off the rails, so to speak. But I don't know how to explain this without literally just sitting down and playing the game and saying, okay, that, and that, and that, and that. Everything. The way they present the levels, the way that the angles are chosen, the way that the corridors lead you in certain kind of directions, the way that you could see just what you need to see in order to see it at the right time in order to make an assumption about A, B, and C, the way that you can interact with certain things with regards to other certain things. All of it is tutorializing, and all of it is brilliantly, beautifully done. I cannot gush enough about how well designed that was. Incredibly awesome stuff. It's also worth noting that I love the fact that Portal has multiple solutions to basically every puzzle. Now, obviously, some of the more simple ones don't. But you can actually solve a lot of puzzles in completely unusual or different ways just based on how good you are or how you think or where you want to place the portals or whatever. In actual fact, this time through, I found myself solving a couple of the puzzles, especially in the later levels, in ways I'd actually never had before, just because it was possible to do so, and it occurred to me naturally to do so based on this playthrough. And I love that. I love that option stuff. And they kind of encourage you to think in unusual directions when you're going through the challenge modes and the difficulty spike of those challenge modes. Which brings me to my final point. All that tutorializing was absolutely necessary. I know several people, including myself, I'll raise my hand on this one, that when we very, very, very first played this game, it seemed much harder than it was, because we just weren't used to thinking like this. The usage of the two portals and the momentum mechanics and the way everything interacted with each other, the basic fundamentals of how this game played, were kind of new. I mean, really, when you think about it. And so getting everything to work right, figuring out how to go through stuff, it took a little bit of getting used to, which is another reason why the tutorializing was so brilliant, especially since it was then followed up by the great off-the-rails section, which is an amazing section of the game, I might add. But I feel this is especially worth warranting because, I don't know about you guys, but when I first played this game, I actually got stuck more than a few times. In actual fact, I made a note of the chamber number when I got to it this time so I could mention it, because I was stuck in chamber 18, Test Chamber 18, for a while when I first played this game. And I admit, I actually got stuck there only for a few minutes. It took me a few minutes to figure it out and be like, oh yeah. But Test Chamber 18 was just like, huh? Go ahead, make fun. I deserve it. I deserve it. I think I'm actually out of things to talk about with one last point. Yep. One more point, then I'm done. I need to share a theory with you guys. It is not my theory. I did not come up with it. It's most commonly referred to as the companion cube theory. Some of you have probably already heard about this. Some of you may not have, but I have to mention it for the sake of completion, and because I think it's an interesting, if incredibly horrifying concept. To summarize, the theory is that there are bound and gagged people in the companion cubes. Now let's back up a bit. If you look at this game, it is very easy to... Okay, Valve in general likes to put lots of subtlety, lots of tiny little details in their games, and they like to do this for two reasons. One, they're good at it, and two, they know their player base are actually going to pay attention enough to catch those details. They know that those little subtle hints and those little bits of foreshadowing and teasing and whatnot will not go unnoticed. A brilliant example of this is the fact that Portal received a kind of out-of-nowhere patch, which actually led into Portal 2. An even better example of this is the whole Half-Life opposing force teasers that were all over the place in Portal. And if you don't even know what I'm talking about, then that just kind of makes me grin. That was actually done as a red herring, by the way. That was done specifically because they knew people would look into it, and people had looked into it. People had noticed some similarities, and were like, oh, well, let's emphasize those similarities. Let's give people just a little bit of a tease, because we're Valve, and we like doing that. Half-Life 3, never heard of it. So they like doing those little details and whatnot. And the other thing they like doing, as I just emphasized, is messing with us. So the companion cube theory is either, in my opinion, absolutely dead accurate, or something that's just, that's a joke, in other words. It's a red herring. But there's a lot of hints about it. If you really go through it, there's a lot of little details about how the companion cubes can talk. Okay, that's pretty obvious. But then there's also the fact that when you go behind the scenes and see some of the things that were left by Ratman, or whatever the hell his name is, you notice a lot of things about people's faces being replaced by companion cubes, and how people did not want to part with their companion cubes. Or in some cases, it is hinted people never actually parted with their companion cubes. And there's also the fact, I forget the evidence for this, forgive me, but there is evidence to suggest the fact that basically every test subject who goes through here, when they fail, gets wrapped up and bound and gagged and put in one of these boxes for the next person to go through, and yeah. And Chell is mentioned as being one of the few people who has gotten as far as she is, all the way to the final test chamber where she's going to be baked into a cake or whatever. Yeah, it's just kind of a horrifying theory, most especially because it's kind of implied that the people in those boxes are conscious. Now, I have a little bit of a, not claustrophobia, but I don't like enclosed spaces. It bugs me. And the idea of being, tied up, wrapped up in a box, bound and gagged, darkness, having just random sounds and no idea what's going on, and the thought of being in that situation and then being dumped into an incinerator is suitably terrifying to me. Now, I'm not sure if I actually believe in the companion cube theory or not, personally, but it does very much seem like the kind of thing they would do, because one of the things that Valve has always done with regards to its writing and its settings is they have always created a setting that basically has a slightly different moral compass than modern-day reality does. This is also actually exemplified by another game series, the Fallout series. I've talked about this before. I will not rehash the territory there. Suffice it to say that they simply are okay with things and consider certain things that are ethically or morally horrifying or repugnant to be normal. So the idea of literally packing up those people into those cubes for that purpose, yeah, I could actually see that happening in that kind of a world. That's all I got. Nothing else to add. I'm going to go well, actually, I do have one last thing. Sorry. One very final thing. And this is just praise of the game. One of the things that I have to say about this game, which is awesome, is that as soon as I finished playing it, I really wanted to install and fire up Portal 2 and give a run-through of that. I can't. I don't have time. I need to work on the next Rumination. But I just felt like sharing that. That's always a nice thing when a game leaves you in the mood to keep playing the series, right? Or to replay it or whatever. But anyways, I'm out. Have a good one. See you in the next time.